Welcome back to Polygamous Origins and Divisions, Part 2 with Hayden Carroll.
Okay, now that we have discussed the necessary history, now we're just going to go into the claims of Lorin Woolley. What did he say in 1929 that gives validity and gives a foundation for virtually all fundamentalist Latter-day Saints today? So here's a very, very quick bio. We don't need to spend too much time on this, just so you know who he was, kind of. Lorin was born October 23rd, 1856, as the third child to Mormon pioneer John W. Woolley, we talked about, and his first wife, Julia Searles Ensign. We'll talk about her in a little bit. Lorin was baptized a member of the church by his father at age 11. On January 5th, he was married to Sarah Ann Roberts in the endowment house on Temple Square. They had 9 children together, 7 sons and 2 daughters. He served as a missionary in the southern United States for 2 years. So ultimately, he was active, right? And look at those dates, right? So we have I think he would have been 31 years old in 1887. Obviously, men sometimes went a little bit older on missions, but he was active right up until even the manifesto. Now, when the manifesto hit, that's when he started to have some dissenting opinions, obviously. Mm-hmm. He continuously opposed the church's position of abandoning the administration of plural marriages, although not living plural marriage himself at the time. And in 1924, he was excommunicated by the mainstream LDS church. It would have been by Heber J. Grant. So I think he would have been the president of the church. Heber J. Grant, he claimed that Heber J. Grant and James E. Talmage were practicing plural marriage after the 1904 Second Manifesto. So funnily enough, he wasn't excommunicated for living plural marriage. He was excommunicated because he was telling lies from the church's perspective that they were living plural marriage still. So he was excommunicated. Okay, that's a little background for him. So taking a step back, so 1924, he's excommunicated. 12 years prior, he starts to make some claims. And at first, they're very vague. And then a little bit later, they become more solidified in 1929. In 1912, he claims to have attended a private meeting in late 1886. He doesn't give an exact date. With President John Taylor and others, wherein President Taylor, he claimed, "Brethren, I will suffer my right hand to be cut off before I will sign such a document as the manifesto." So basically, I'll give you more details here, but he's saying, well, in 1912, he's still a member of the church at this point. He's saying, I was in a meeting where President John Taylor, who passed away, 20 years ago, he said he didn't like the manifesto. And so this is him kind of, right, he's kind of entering the dissenting period, right? This is a year after they've excommunicated John W. Taylor. So he's maybe feeling a little bit more confident that, okay, maybe we're going to get together and start to have these testimony meetings or these gatherings of these dissenters, if you will. He didn't see himself as a dissenter. He saw the church as dissenting.
Just a quick question about, he's getting excommunicated for saying that Heber J. Grant and Talmage, right? That they were taking on plural wives. Do we have any historical documents that's what does he have to gain by lying about them? What is there to gain? He's going to be excommunicated. He seems faithful at this point. Do we have any documentation of whether or not it was actually lies, or did just other people not know?
Well, I will say this. When we say he was faithful at this point, when the 1904 manifesto especially came around, I don't think he was feeling real hot about the church, at least the leadership. He was faithful. I would consider him faithful back in the 1880s, when he's younger. This is 20, 30 years later. So he's in his 50s and 60s. He's a little bit older now. This picture is deceiving because when he was excommunicated, he wasn't this young, right? I could probably put an older picture of him, but I don't know, to be honest. His claims or his accusations against Heber J. Grant were so serious or taken seriously enough to where Heber J. Grant got up in front of the church at General Conference and he basically said, I think he named Lorin Woolley by name and said, Lorin Woolley's saying that I'm taking wives. And Lorin Woolley told the whole story about it, how they went to a hotel and it was there that they were taking plural wives. And Heber J. Grant gets up in front of the church and says, this is untrue. And essentially he gets excommunicated for claiming that. What he has to gain, I don't know. That's a really good question. Maybe the fundamentalists who are watching can comment and tell us a little bit about that. I don't know.
Yeah. I would just say the quote you use here about giving his right hand before signing such a document was something that was shared and preached and taught in the FLDS. I heard that quote so many times.
Yes. Here's what, and this will probably resonate with you. The fundamentalists today, they don't look at the history, the actual history of John Taylor's time. They look at the claims of Lorin Woolley and what he said about the 1800s. Does that make sense? Like they're not actually going to the documents, because that, if they did that, they'd be in for that's what we're going to talk about tonight. They'd be in for a scare, kind of, because what Lorin Woolley said, not, and I'll just give you a spoiler, it really does not line up with what the historical record says about what was happening at that time in the journals and in the witnesses of that time. So when you're hearing this from fundamentalists, it does not surprise me one bit that they would take this quote, quoted by Lorin Woolley. There's no record of it in John Taylor's handwriting, nothing like that. There's no record of it at all. The first time we're hearing this phrase is in 1912 from Lorin. So he makes that claim. Then 17 years later, he gets more specific. So do you see in 1912, he talks about a meeting. Then in 1929, after he's excommunicated for 5 years, after his father has passed away, he starts to, he used, these are his words. He says, I'm remembering now more details, that the Lord is basically giving me these details back to me. And here are the details of the meeting. And these may sound familiar to you as well. This is like the 1929 standard edition of his testimony. It's the longer one. The 1912 is fairly short in comparison to the 1929 one. He gives the exact date, which he says this meeting took place on September 27th, 1886. Where do you think he got that date from? That looks familiar, doesn't it? He says, so he's kind of using, by the way, he's kind of using this history. In 1912, I don't know how widespread the 1886 revelation found by John W. Taylor was widespread, but by 1929, it was definitely widespread amongst the fundamentalists. They all knew about it. They probably had copies of it. Anyway, he knew the date. So he definitely, picked that date. Fundamentalists would say that actually was the date. The duration, he says, the duration of the meeting was 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. without intermission for 8 hours. That's called the 8-hour meeting. That's a very, amongst fundamentalists, you probably heard that, the 8-hour meeting. That's what he's referring to at this point. He says who specifically attended: himself and 12 others, including John Taylor. And I'll tell you who those people are in just a second. He says those in attendance were put under covenant by John Taylor to consecrate their lives, liberty, and property in defending the principle of plural marriage. So he's saying, I'm in this private meeting. John Taylor saying he's not going to sign any manifesto. He puts us under covenant. And he says him, his father, his sister, his mom was there. He says there was a young man, the age of 15, who was there, and all the way up to George Buchanan. He says George Buchanan was there, and he put us all under covenant, all 12 of us, to live plural marriage. This is what he's saying in 1929. He said John Taylor frequently arose and stood above the floor, and his countenance and being were so enveloped by light and glory that it was difficult for us to look upon him. So supernatural claims of John Taylor floating and glowing. He says that in this meeting, John Taylor received the 1886 revelation found by his son. And he says John Taylor made 5 copies, and we'll talk about those in a second. Okay, so that's the first meeting that's he's saying happening on September 27th, 1886. After this 8-hour meeting, Lorin claims that another 5-hour meeting was held with only 5 of the men from the first meeting, and I'll tell you who those people are. He's also said the resurrected Joseph Smith was there, in which President John Taylor ordained these 5 men, 5 out of the 13 who were present for the first meeting in this new private meeting. He ordains them to the office of high priest apostle, which is a never before heard of priesthood office, right? We've never heard that before, and we've never heard it after, at least in the mainstream church. Lorin Woolley, from our perspective, he obviously made this up. The fundamentalists would say, no, this is a true office, and it's above that of a normal apostle. So Lorin Woolley is saying John Taylor is secretly, by the way, that's kind of where this all falls into. John Taylor secretly ordained him and his father and a couple other people, 3 other people, to be high priest apostles. He said they were given authority to perpetuate plural marriage, regardless of the direction or stance of future church leaders would take. Among fundamentalists, this group would become known, as taught by Lorin Woolley, as the Council of Friends or the Priesthood Council. You maybe heard that before, for decades to come. So the Council of Friends and the Priesthood Council, that's the same thing. That's the same group. Okay. He also says each member, and those high priest apostles that were ordained, the 5 of them, and I'll show you them in a second. He said each of them were given a copy of the 1886 revelation. There's no evidence of that. We'll talk about that in a second. Okay, really quick. What prompted this meeting? This is Lorin Woolley's words. He said that the months before this meeting, this 8-hour meeting and this 5-hour meeting that happened on the same day, he says George Buchanan, who was the first counselor, on his own initiative, selected a committee to write a statement or manifesto that would meet the objections of church leaders on plural marriage. They met from time to time to discuss the situation. And a lot of these conversations, he said, happened up in Centerville at his dad's house in Davis County. On September 26th, this is still the claims of Lorin Woolley. This is his words. He says on September 26th, the day before, George Buchanan and others met with President John Taylor at my father's residence in Centerville, Davis County, Utah, and presented the document for President Taylor's consideration. So he's saying that George Buchanan and a committee wrote another manifesto, not Wilford Woodruff Manifesto and not the 1904 Joseph F. Smith Manifesto, but this is another manifesto, like a pre-manifesto, that he's saying George Buchanan wrote and wanted President Taylor to sign it, which would basically call off plural marriage. He says, we discussed the proposed manifesto at length, but we were unable to become united in the discussion. Finally, so he's claiming to be in this meeting, right? Finally, George Buchanan suggested that President Taylor take the matter up with the Lord and decide the same the next day. So he said, President, how about you sleep on it? And tomorrow we'll talk about it. So this is now the next morning. This is September 27th. He says the next morning, this is details of that meeting, the 8-hour meeting. He says, we assemble ourselves together in a meeting. John Taylor called the meeting to order. He had the manifesto and prepared it under the direction of George Buchanan, and he read it over again. He then put each person under covenant, there it is again, that he or she would defend the principle of celestial or plural marriage, and that they would consecrate their lives, liberty, and property to this end, that they would personally sustain and uphold the principle. He says President John Taylor placed his finger on the document and rising from the floor about a foot or 18 inches, and with countenance animated with the Spirit of the Lord and raising his right arm to the square, he said, sign that document, never. I would suffer my right hand to be severed from my body for sanction it, never. I would suffer my tongue to be torn out from its roots in my mouth before I would sanction it. That probably sounds familiar to you. That's the standard version of that quote.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. All the stuff that you're reading here, the quotes, the meeting information, part of me is like, oh, yeah, no, it makes sense. That's definitely what happened because I was taught it so much as a young boy. Obviously I don't believe in it anymore, but it doesn't even sound crazy to me because it was pounded into my mind basically my entire life growing up. So very interesting.
And I think you are proof that the fundamentalists today, the history that they're studying are the claims of Lorin Woolley in 1929. I can't say that enough. Like, for your viewers who are listening, the fundamentalists are not actually looking at the actual history in the 1800s. They're looking at what Lorin Woolley said about it. And they trust him, right? They see him as the one man. And that's where they claim their authority from. Okay, a couple other things before we get to the attendees and things like that, where it gets really interesting. He says President Taylor stated that document, the manifesto, was from the lower regions or hell, basically. He said that one half of this people will apostatize over the principle for which we are now hiding. He also said that the day will come when a document similar to that manifesto, then under consideration, would be adopted by the church. So he's saying John Taylor prophesied of this. And he said, following which apostasy and whoredom would be rampant in the church. So this is excommunicated Lorin Woolley in 1929 saying, I was in a meeting a long time ago. I was ordained an apostle. I have authority to live plural marriage in 1929. John Taylor wanted nothing to do with this church after it adopted. If he was to live on, he wanted nothing to do with it. And here's my proof. My testimony ultimately is the proof that he gives. Any questions about that? That's his claims. The next slide is getting into the investigation. Do you have any questions about his claim?
I think we can get into the investigation and probably bring up some of my questions as far as the claims go in the investigation part. Yeah. So I say, let's keep. Perfect. We can keep going.
And this is where it gets fun, especially for Latter-day Saints and for people, obviously people who don't support Lorin, because you're going to see very quickly what happens to his claims when you just look at the historical record. So, do his claims withstand any historical observation? Here is a list. Your grandfather's not quite this old, so he's coming up here in a little bit. But this is the original alleged 8-hour meeting attendees. This is everybody who Lorin Woolley said was at the meeting, the 8-hour meeting in 1886. He says these are the people who were present when the 1886 revelation was received. Now, here's the first question we have to ask ourselves. Just being historians, right? Just looking at the historical record, we have to ask this question first. Did any of the alleged 8-hour meeting attendees make statements about Lorin's claims when he made them in 1929? So when he was giving these claims in 1929, what were these people saying? Did they confirm it? Did they deny it? Well, here's what we're left with. John Taylor didn't say anything because he was dead. Charles Wilkins was also dead. George Buchanan was dead. Samuel Bateman, his father, passed away. Lorin Woolley was obviously alive. He was the one giving the claims. His mother was dead. John Nuttall was dead. Charles Burrell was dead. His sister was dead. Samuel Bateman was dead. Now this is where it gets interesting. We have 2 living members who are alive in 1929, and they both give testimonies, both conflicting with what Lorin Woolley said. So here's the first one. Daniel Bateman was a friend of Lorin. He was a supporter of plural marriage. And we don't even have to read this whole thing. What you should know, though, is that his sister basically wrote that he was a dissenter and he was essentially excommunicated from the church. He didn't live plural marriage. There's no record of him living plural marriage. But he did say, this is the one witness, if you will, that Lorin Woolley and fundamentalists would look to who kind of corroborated with Lorin Woolley. So this is what he said. He said, I was privileged to be at the 8-hour meeting of September 27th, 1886, spoken of by Brother Woolley. I myself act as one of the guards, the brethren of those exciting times. The proceedings of this meeting was related by Lorin Woolley are correct in every detail. When Lorin Woolley gave his account, which was written down by Joseph Musser, Daniel Bateman added his testimony because he was a living member who Lorin claimed was there with him. Now, he says he was in the 8-hour meeting, but he says, I was not present when the 5 spoken of by Brother Woolley were set apart for special work during the 5-hour meeting. By the way, one of them was his dad, Samuel Bateman. So he's saying, I was there at the first meeting. I was there when John Taylor was floating in the air and, glowing. But he says, I was not there when he set these men apart. So ultimately, he confirms that. Now, on the other hand, we have George Earle. Long story short, he says the exact opposite. He was 15 years old in 1886. He actually lived around. He was kind of like a mail boy for the Woolley family and for John Taylor. He was around, and he remained aloof from the movement of plural marriages until his death. He only had one wife. Right? Lorin Woolley is saying he made a covenant to live plural marriage. There's no evidence of that. He never rejected the manifestos. There's no evidence of that. And eventually, the fundamentalists would approach him later in life and say, tell us that you were there. Like, give us your testimony that you were there. Lorin Woolley said you were there. And in 1949, he gave a testimony denying Lorin Woolley's claims that he had been involved in any private meetings. He remained a faithful member of the mainstream LDS Church until 1956 when he died. Now, we don't have to read the whole thing, but if your viewers want to stop and read this, this is him saying, look at the second to last paragraph at the end. He says, never did I hear or see any such things. I doubt anyone else ever did. And I hereby solemnly affirm that I saw nothing supernatural like that, nor heard of such a sermon. And I firmly believe it could not have escaped my observation as it occurred. Essentially, he says, I was not there. And if it happened, I would have known about it.
I just had to read at the top here. It says, to whom it may concern. And that's also how the first manifesto and possibly the second, I'm not sure, but at least the first manifesto starts out that way too, to whom it may concern. Yes. Let's just say the FLDS people, if anything starts off with to whom it may concern, they laugh and mock it. Because they say, who starts out something like that? To whom it may concern. This clearly isn't. This is someone just trying to follow their own agenda and working against God's church. To whom it may concern.
That's so funny.
So I noticed that's how it started out, and I just had to point out that I have in my own home and throughout the church heard people mock that phrase over and over again. So it's just a funny side note, I guess.
No, I appreciate that personal insight. And who knows, maybe we'd feel the same way if we were in their shoes. And that's kind of what I always like to say is, if I had their beliefs, I probably would be saying the same thing. Let's have some grace towards them, right? Really fun short story with this. George Earle, he was nearly impossible to find things out about online. He was one of the 13 people in this alleged meeting. Like, I want to know, what can I learn about this man? He was alive when Lorin Woolley made the claim. So what did he say? And it took me so long to figure out something about him. Basically, long story short, on his family search, the church does genealogy on familysearch.com or whatever. There was somebody who was uploading photos of George Earle like less than a year ago on his profile. And I'm like, who is this person? Who has all these photos of George Earle? As I'm trying to find out information about him. Anyway, I look at the profile and I call this phone number of this guy. And he answers the phone. He says, hello. And I say, hi, my name's Hayden Carroll. I found your number on Family Search. I see that you've been uploading photos of George Earle. Do you know who he is? And he says, yeah, that's my grandpa. So wow. I have a conversation with him, and I actually gave this whole presentation to him. He loved it. He was actually unaware of all of this. But from him, that's actually where I got this letter. This letter, picture of this letter was sent to me from George Earle's grandson, and he's in his late 70s now. So kind of cool.
Interesting.
That's so interesting. Yeah.
We also,
I'm loving this. Yeah. This is so interesting to me. Definitely things. Yeah. I mean, this isn't our visit with you today isn't about this, but I could go on and on and on about how the FLDS would disagree and how they would interpret things to make
Sure.
it fit their agenda or fit within their belief
100%.
system. But that's not what this is about. This is about showing
Sure.
the evidence and what you have found here, because
Yeah.
ultimately anyone from any religion can interpret
Yeah.
things different to
100%.
prove that what they believe is the truth. So, but I just want to
Mm-hmm.
point out that this stuff to me is very intriguing, and I haven't seen some of these documents either, even though I've heard about them before.
Yeah,
Yeah.
along with that note, like even hearing, the different testimonies of what Lorin Woolley said happened and all of that. And there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people out there as viewers that are hearing that and they're like, that all sounds crazy and made up right from the beginning. But I just want to take a second to say that as we're listening to these, it totally depends on perspective, because growing up mainstream LDS, a lot of things that Lorin Woolley was saying are things that I could totally see have happening within Joseph Smith's times. The fact that at temple dedications there were people were seeing with their spiritual eyes like chariots of fire, and there were these amazing
Right.
spiritual confirmations and things, and the idea of there being like supernatural things happening is very
Mm-hmm.
close to our church fundamentals. And so the
Mm-hmm.
idea of those type of things happening almost didn't surprise me either. I was like, oh, that sounds like something
Hmm.
that could happen
Sure.
if you believed in that person as authority.
Right.
So coming
Yes.
from mainstream Mormonism and that history, you have to understand that the people that followed Lorin Woolley are not that different from the people who continue to
Mm.
follow the mainstream Mormonism line, because they
Yeah.
already had supernatural worldviews. They already had there were definitely mystical worldview
Yep.
points in with Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, and those type of things would happen. There would be meetings, on polygamy in secret with
Yep.
Joseph Smith, where he wasn't telling a lot of people. He was only telling his friends. Well, we guarantee there were secret meetings that were happening that nobody knew about, that were never documented, right? So
Mm-hmm.
secret meetings, supernatural events, all of that isn't outside the realm of possibility when you look at like Mormonism history as a whole. So while the outsider might look
Mm-hmm.
and be like, well, it's very obvious that Lorin Woolley is making all
Yeah.
this up and there might be no historical evidence for it, again, I feel like the
Mm-hmm.
worldview, it would be
Sure.
easy for a member in that time to just as easily say they're going with who they believe is that one man power more than what they are the evidences of whatever happened at that
Yes.
time.
I would say one thing, and maybe this is my bias coming out, but I would say, as I'm about to show you, not only is there no historical record for what Lorin Woolley said, the historical record actually contradicts what he said. So that's one that I would say is slightly different. Is I think there's good documents for what happened in the early church, and some non-documents, but I think you'd be very hard pressed to find out that there is a contradictory history. So anyway, just hold on to that. I appreciate you saying that, because I agree. I think if we held the same presuppositions as the fundamentalists, we'd be able to do the same. And maybe we have done. Maybe I've done that. Maybe you've done that.
Yeah, yeah, and I just want to sorry, one more thing that it just made me think of
Mhm.
with that too is the hindsight's 2020, right? Like we can look at
Mhm.
historical documents now, but in that time
Yeah.
there might have been more people that
Yeah.
are going off of their spiritual confirmation of who they believe to be
Totally.
the one man, because maybe like you said, they might not have had any of the
Yeah.
information. And so they're going off
100%.
of that spiritual confirmation more than what they were able to look at the historical documents, the likelihood they even had that available. I mean, look at how hard it is for us
Yeah.
to find it. And we have the internet and all of this
Yeah.
sharing. And back then, they
Yeah.
probably didn't have access to be able
Oh,
to fact check what Lorin Woolley's saying or what Joseph Smith's saying or Brigham. You're going off of spiritual confirmation for a
Right.
lot of religious
mhm.
understanding and belief systems.
Yeah.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I think that's totally valid. Okay, so here we go. We understand that all of them had passed away except for Daniel Bateman and George Earl, and they give conflicting testimonies, right? Which
Mm.
Mhm.
causes some issues, more issues. So here's the next question I had to ask myself. Did any of the alleged 8-hour meeting attendees leave any contemporary records of their experience, right? Did any of them have a journal, right? Do we have access to these journals? And as I did my research, I found that there were 3 of the men who had kept a journal entry on September 27th, 1886. And here's where you start to get some contradictory claims. John Nuttall, just as to be transparent, we know John Nuttall kept a journal, but apparently it's lost. We don't know where it is. I did all my power to look for it, and we have no record of it. If somebody has that or access to it, I would appreciate if you could post that. I understand that even the greatest scholars can't find it. So we have John Taylor, George Buchanan, Samuel Bateman, who left left journal records for this day in that year. And here's what they are. They're really short. John Taylor said, this is his journal, President Cannon is still improving his health. The rest of the party as well. That's what he said about that day. So if there was a meeting, he didn't mention it in his journal. Here's another interesting fact.
Covenanted not to share.
Yeah,
just kidding.
Okay. Well, you know what's funny about
that? I agree with you
wholeheartedly. But you know what's funny about that? A lot of fundamentalists will claim that now. They'll say, oh, they had to keep it a secret. But what's funny about that claim or that position is Lorin Woolley, he didn't say that John Taylor said to keep it a secret. He actually said John Taylor told him to go ordain more men, to go spread this. So it's not to say that, oh, this was supposed to be a secret. Well, Lorin Woolley never said that, and he was the only living person in the second meeting anyway, the ordination meeting. Okay, here's something interesting. President John Taylor's itinerary places him at the home of John Woolley Taylor from October 12th through November 3rd, which falls outside of the range of September. So the record we have for John Taylor, he was not even in or at John Woolley's home in September of 1886. So that's something interesting. Now we could say, oh, maybe the dates were off. So it's not a home run necessarily for Latter-day Saints. Okay, George Buchanan. This one's interesting. His journal entry said, attended to our usual business. I am not well, but improving. By the way, that bolded and italicized usual, that's mine. I apologize. I should have put my emphasis there. But that's what he said. He said, we had our usual business. I'm not well, but I'm improving. So if he was in a meeting where John Taylor, by the way, if the meeting actually happened, this would really be like the second most important meeting next to the first vision. Like if you have a prophet saying we're going to live plural marriage forever, no matter what the church does, this is an important day. And you have George Buchanan saying we attended to our usual business. So to me, it doesn't sound like anything special happened that day. Okay, Samuel Bateman. This is interesting. He said he did spend a lot of the day at John Woolley's home. He said he was reading and pitching quoits, which actually I meant to look up that word, quoits. Somebody probably in the comment section can tell us what that is. Maybe it's like hay. I don't know. Helping load 2 loads of barley. He said at night I went with the mail. I called it Sister B's. I don't know who that is. And met Abert, sheriff of Salt Lake County. Got back at 2:00. All right. So here's my concern. Lorin Woolley said the meeting went from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. And that's all day. That's the working day. And you have Samuel Bateman saying, I was loading barley and I was basically doing manual labor that day. So my question to Lorin Woolley is why are these people who we have their journals, why are they not mentioning the 1886 meeting? That's my concern. Okay. Yeah. We're kind of wrapping up towards the end. Here's kind of where I'm going to ask some more pointed questions. And I'm asking this as a Latter-day Saint. So the fundamentalists who watch this may say there's some bias here, but I'm asking questions that matter. Tell me what you guys think about this. Here's some, there's some facts and then there's some questions that follow. Not a single contemporary record or piece of evidence has been uncovered that would suggest that any of Lorin's 1886 event claims occurred. Not a single mention of these events has been found in any historical record available to us left by anybody, not only from people who were said to be involved. Interestingly, John Taylor, according to Lorin, not only didn't mention anything about secrecy, this goes to your point that you said, but he actually ordained the five ordained men that they should seal plural marriages and ordain other men to do so. No record of either of these things happening even one time by any of them has ever been found. The first mentions of the 1886 meetings is known in the historical record. Is by Lorin Woolley in the 1920s. So again, just some blatant facts that there's no record of this whatsoever. And I've mentioned that before. Okay, really quick. Here's the original Council of Friends. Lorin Woolley in 1929 said, I'm the only one of the 5 now living. And so far as I know, all 5 of the brethren. So he's making a truth claim here. He says, everyone who was ordained with me, the 4 others, my dad and the others, remain true and faithful to the covenants they entered into and the responsibilities placed upon them at this time. So he's saying that, and here's the responsibility, by the way. Can you see this quote with on top? We kind of already talked about this. We don't have to read the whole thing, but essentially they were set apart to live plural marriage and perpetuate it regardless of what the church was going to do. Now, here's just some quick historical facts about those who Lorin Woolley said were ordained. Here's what happened in their lives after this. Charles Wilkins was ordained a patriarch by Joseph F. Smith in 1911. He stayed in full fellowship with the church. He served the last few years of his life on Temple Square. He remained a monogamist his entire life. Which my question is, if he was ordained to live plural marriage and perpetuate it, why is he a monogamist? Nothing in his history suggests that he performed plural marriages or made covenant to do so. He also didn't oppose the manifestos. He remained faithful in the church. George Buchanan, this is interesting. He said, this is a quote from him, "I know it was God who dictated the 1890 manifesto, that it was issued in accordance with the requirements of the Spirit of God." So you have Lorin Woolley saying George Buchanan made a covenant to uphold plural marriage. Now you have in post 1890, George Buchanan saying, no, I sustain this document. He and John Taylor endorsed the anti-polygamy constitution. He urged the members to support it. So we know that history. Samuel Bateman said something similar. He said, "I voted to sustain President Woodruff in this matter of the manifesto. As soon as I had done it, a sense of peace and contentment came over me." He received no plural wives from 1886 until his death. No evidence has ever come to light to suggest he ever performed any type of plural marriage or marriage sealing at all, or had received such commission or authority. He died faithful in the church. So does that make sense? So you're having Lorin Woolley saying these guys were the guys who are supposed to perpetuate it, and let's look at their lives. And my response is, it doesn't look like they did a very good job of upholding their covenants. John Woolley's different. Here's John Woolley. He did get excommunicated, and during his excommunication trial in 1914 for performing plural marriages, here's something interesting about him. Before, I think he's before his stake president and the High Council, he never mentions any special ordination or authority or covenant. When they said, "Why did you do this?" he didn't say, "Well, in 1886, I was ordained, as high priest apostle, and this is why I'm doing it." Instead, he offered a completely different explanation for the source of his authority. He said, this is John Taylor's words, John Woolley. He said, "Some months ago, I met Matthias Calley, who had been disfellowshipped 3 years prior, on the streets, and he asked me if I was familiar with the sealing ceremony. John Woolley was a temple sealer, so he knew the ceremony. He said, I told him I was. He said, if any good men come to you, don't turn him down. I believe that from this statement, that it was still proper that plural marriages be solemnized, and that President Smith had authorized Calley to instruct me." So when approached and saying, "Why are you doing this?" he doesn't say, "I have special authority." He says, "One of the apostles told me I could, so that's why I'm doing it." Like I said, John Woolley wanted to be back in the church, but he wasn't willing to give up his stance on plural marriage, so he was never. He died an unbaptized member of the church. Okay, really quick. These ones will be pretty fast. I have she gets her own little page because she's a sister, and then I have just one little line for each of the other individuals. These are the other people who were at the meeting, at the 8-hour meeting, allegedly. We don't have records of them. They weren't alive when he made the claims in 1929. But here's what we do know about them. His sister began her own journal just weeks after the alleged 1886 meeting, but her entries do not reflect a compulsion to sustain plural marriage. She leaves no record. She doesn't mention any sort of meeting. When Lorin Woolley began fighting against the church after 1904 regarding polygamy, she actually distanced herself from her brother, and she stayed with the church. Amy remained a monogamous wife to her husband, Thomas Cherry, after the 1888 wedding. So again, you see Lorin Woolley saying, well, my sister covenanted to live plural marriage, but it just does not look like that. Okay, really quick. Charles Burrell, he was a lifetime monogamist. He left no record of opposition towards the manifestos. He remained faithful in the church. Lorin's mom, she didn't live plural marriage as far as I know. She was not a plural wife. She left no record of opposition to the manifestos. She remained faithful in the church. John Nuttall, who was the secretary to John Taylor, entered into one plural marriage in 1875, 11 years before the meeting. It didn't take any wives after that, obviously. Left no record showing opposition to the manifestos. He also remained faithful in the church. Samuel Seddon was a bishop. He's a lifetime monogamist. After his wife's death in 1904, he married again, but not plurally, and he left no record of opposing the manifestos. So there you kind of have a wrap, if you will, of the attendees. We look at their lives and we say, what did their lives look like? Okay, one other little quote. This is kind of where this is just kind of wrap up. He said, after the 8-hour meeting, basically John Taylor made 5 copies. No evidence of these copies have ever been found. I don't even know why he said that, unless he had one, but there was none. Okay, he said George Buchanan made a manifesto. There's no evidence of him writing a manifesto or creating a committee. There's no record whatsoever. And you can look at his journal. His journal is published online, all of it. You can almost look at every entry of every day that he wrote. We have his journal entries. So here's kind of a pointed question from me. Why does the historical record show that no one alleged the 1886 meeting participants lived their alleged covenants to defend plural marriage? Lorin Woolley gives his answer to this question. He essentially says, John Taylor said that we would forget these things and that eventually the Lord would remind us when it was necessary. So he said, I forgot. Now it's 1929. I remember. I'm now the man. Right. And that's my position as well. Here's another pointed question from me. What
Right.
good does it do to what good does it do to have this meeting to put everyone under covenant to defend plural marriage to their death if the Lord would make every single one of them, apparently except Lorin Woolley, forget everything said and done in the meeting and forget the meeting itself ever occurred? Well, here's why. Here's why the Lord needed to have this meeting, according to Lorin Woolley. It's because when he started talking about it, remember who was up there before? It was John Taylor. Now Lorin Woolley is the leader. And here's kind of where your grandfather comes in, and this is kind of reaching the end of this. He claims after his father dies that his father visits him and informs him that he is to fill the vacancy of the Council of Friends. His dad, as a ghost, basically comes back to him and says, "You're now the leader. You need to call this council," even though his father never talked about it when he was alive. Over the next 4 years, Lorin ordains the following plural marriage advocates as high priest apostles with his newly remembered authority. And you'll know these names. You could consider these the fathers of plural marriage, is how some people may look at them. Broadbent, Barlow, Musser, Zitting, Woolley, Kelsch. This is
there he is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is your grandfather entering into an authority that Lorin Woolley claimed. And I'm sure your grandfather also believed it. I have no doubt that these men were faithful into what they knew was true. This is not a bag on them whatsoever. I think that the faultiness mostly lies with Lorin Woolley. Obviously, I don't believe it. Now, I think I have most of these dates correct. Correct me if I'm wrong. They were each excommunicated over subsequent years after they were called, a few of them before they were called. The last slide I have is do you have any questions about that? I have one final slide with all the breakoffs, and that's basically it. Do you have any questions before we look at this for a second?
No, not that I can think of. I'll let you know if something comes up, though.
Okay, awesome. So I have this in here. I apologize. This is for a Latter-day Saint audience. We don't have to really talk about this. Kind of in my presentation, I say, well, Christ said we can look at the fruits of false prophets. I obviously would view Lorin Woolley as a false prophet. And here's what I call the fruits of Lorin Woolley, kind of as a joke. We have the original Council of Friends that he claims he was on in 1886. In 1929, he says, "I remember this authority. I'm calling a new council," and that includes your grandfather. From that council, we have the Kingston breakoff, which happened in 1939 when Eldon claimed to receive revelation and authority. You guys probably know about that. Now, this is where it gets interesting. In 1934, 1935, Lorin Woolley and Broadbent both die within like a year of each other. So we have this new council headed technically by John Barlow, because he's most senior, and Joseph Musser. Now, this is where we kind of get the split of the FLDS and the AUB. They start to have disagreements about how plural marriage should be lived. Should it be assigned by the leaders, or should it be courtship and dating, right? And so Barlow is of the mindset, we need to assign it. And Musser says, no, we need to let people figure it out on their own. Barlow, as the senior member, he calls all of those people in green. And you see Rulon Jefferson there. We're going to talk about him in a second. You're familiar with him. He gets called by Barlow. All of these people side with Barlow in this doctrinal disagreement. And they say, no, it should be the one man who assigns it. But what happens is after Barlow dies, Musser ultimately becomes the leader. But he's kind of faced, and your grandfather's there, number 3 now. He's kind of faced against the rest of the council, where he's advocating for courtship and dating, plural marriage, and they're advocating for assignment. And so what he does is he does something unprecedented. He calls a new apostle, high priest apostle, but instead of putting him at the bottom, he calls him as the second elder. He calls him as the second right-hand man. And he does that because Rulon Allred, who's involved with them already, he also agrees that marriage should be done by dating and courtship. That's how you get the AUB, right? That's how the AUB does it. So what happens is there's some disagreements here. The rest of the council says, you can't do that. You can't put Allred in front of us. From what I understand, actually, Zitting, Woolley, and Kelsch, they were a little bit older. They were more established. They actually weren't too involved in these conversations. And so when we have Musser, who basically says, no, we're going to do it my way, because I'm the head guy. Basically what he tells from Leroy Johnson all the way down to Alma Timpson, numbers 5 through 12, he says, actually, it was 6 through 12. He says, all of you who were called by Barlow, you're now all released. So he dismantles this council. And he says, if you're not going to agree with me, I'm the head man, you're all released. So they start their own council, and it's headed by Leroy Johnson. And you see where that's going. Musser basically
Yep.
dies not long after that in 54. And so that leaves Rulin Allred as the head, and eventually they become the AUB. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this down. The bottom 3 boxes, I'm just going to move them down. Same boxes. Now, I promise this is the last slide. I apologize for this taking a little bit longer than we had planned. Here's where you start to get the breakdown. So, and this is where it gets interesting and fun for us because you're involved in this, or we're involved in this rather, growing up. So on the old priesthood council side, they're not called the FLDS yet. You have Leroy Johnson, but you have Marion Hammond and Alma Tipson who have some disagreements, and they break off and they become Centennial Park. So that leaves Leroy Johnson and Rulin Jeffs as first and second. Now, and then we have another break off here. I don't know much about these guys, but this is the Blackmore group, and you probably know more about them than I do.
I assume you're referring to the Blackmore group in Canada, right?
I don't know much about them, if anything. I just know Winston Blackmore kind of head.
Yeah, so Winston Blackmore actually was a part of the FLDS church and followed Rulin Jeffs and Leroy Johnson, and then Rulin Jeffs, and then Warren Jeffs actually for a long time. In fact, Winston Blackmore was the bishop of the Canadian group when I was a boy growing up in the FLDS. So it was just very recent. It was very recent that Winston Blackmore fell away or chose to move away from the FLDS beliefs.
And that was after Warren Jeffs was put in prison. So Warren Jeffs went to prison, and Winston Blackmore basically took up that mantle in Canada and said, we're not going to continue to follow that. But it was clear after Warren.
Yeah, it was recent.
Got you. Okay, that makes sense. So maybe I should move this box because I have one more box coming below the old priesthood council, because basically what happens is Leroy Johnson dies and Marion Hammond apostatized in their mind. He left. He did his own thing in Centennial Park. That leaves Rulin Jeff at the top. Jeff's at the top. And here's what Rulin does that nobody else has done before. When council members start dying, he doesn't call any new ones. So eventually he becomes the one sole man with no council whatsoever. And eventually he has a stroke, as far as I understand it. You know, this is your history. And then I understand that eventually his son takes over. And so maybe I should put the Blackmore group coming off of the FLDS at the bottom. Maybe that's one. Maybe I could mark it from there. But that's and I'm definitely not here to teach you your history, but that's essentially my understanding of how we get the FLDS. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, yes. Aside from the Blackmore, the Winston Blackmore, everything else looks like it falls in line pretty well. It's just very, very well laid out. Good job with this, by the way. Thank you for doing this and showing this to our audience as well. And it just, all of the Lorin Woolley claims and all of that, it just goes to show how convenient, or not necessarily convenient, but how different it was back in those days when you couldn't just Google or reach out to someone across the world to verify stories or verify information. So it was a very different time back then.
Yeah, going off word of mouth, right? They kind of had to for a lot of stuff.
Right.
Yep. Yeah, and so that's why I really don't blame these people. They were doing what they thought was right, and they didn't really have any way to confirm it other than spiritual confirmation, which can lead people ways that maybe they wouldn't naturally go.
Mm-hmm.
So not that this matters. We don't have to talk about this, but here are just all the other groups that came off of the Allred group, or the AUB. That's basically the end of this. You start to see all these groups. Yeah. So anyway, isn't that interesting? And this is what I would call the fruits of Lorin Woolley. Lorin Woolley made these claims. He started this council. There's disagreements, so there were some splits off and some schisms. And this is also fruits kind of the one man rule, right? This is all of them saying only one of us can have the authority, and if you're not going to agree with me, I think it's funny how Musser basically said, I'm calling Rulin Allred because he supports me, and the rest of you can go do your own thing. And then he calls all these other guys, and they start their own council, and you just have splits after splits. So anyway, that's my that's my brief dissertation on the history of Mormon fundamentalism.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Hayden. That was so interesting, and I learned a lot as well. And a lot of the stuff that we talked about was stuff that I was taught as a young boy, but as a young boy, the history of my church wasn't that important to me. I don't know if I'm the only one as a young boy.
That's really common.
Common. So it was more just the stories I would hear. I didn't really go in and verify all of this information through journal reading or things like that. It was more, this is what was being taught in my family. This is what the journal passages were read in family meetings and things like that I remember. So it was very cool to kind of see it all come together, like you put it. So
well, thank you
very
so
cool.
much for having me on. I think this is a
Yeah.
message that everybody needs to hear, regardless of their connection or their affiliation with the church or out of the church. So thank you so much for responding and having me on. I know it's a lot. I know it feels like a firehouse. It's so much information. I'll just be honest with you. I've probably put in at least 100 hours over the last 6 months of my life looking into this. And this is kind of the accumulation of all of those, reading the books and the articles and doing history and interviewing the grandchildren. Now you're on my list of grandchildren of these people involved with Charles. So anyway, it's been fun. And I
Of
really appreciate what
course.
you guys are
Thank you
doing.
so
So
much
thank you.
again for coming on. Yeah. I mean, there's just, yeah, so much history, so much information, and it was just all great information. So we appreciate you being here and being a part of this. And if anybody watching or listening is in a polygamous group or is needing any information or resources, and we have the links below for that. And if you want to continue to hear more about what it was like for Sam to grow up in polygamy, then please like and subscribe.
Yes. Thank you once again, Hayden. And thank you all for being here with us again today. We look forward to talking with you soon.
Talk to y'all soon.